July 24th, 1944. The hedgerows near Saint-Lô, Normandy. Sergeant Curtis Grubb Culin III pressed his back against the wet earth of a foxhole, watching in horror as another Sherman tank attempted to climb the ancient Norman hedgerow. The tank's hull rose like a rearing horse, its soft underbelly exposed to the German 88mm anti-tank gun hidden in the next field. The explosion came instantly. Fire burst through the driver's hatch as the 30-ton machine crashed backward, its 5-man crew already dead. Culin scribbled in his rain-soaked notebook with a pencil stub words that would later be found in the National Archives among the most significant documents of the Normandy campaign. These hedges are not obstacles. They are death traps designed by history, perfected by Germans. We are fighting the earth itself. What Culin did not yet know was that his observation of this moment would lead to one of the most decisive battlefield innovations of the Second World War. Within 2 weeks, his invention would transform over 500 American tanks into hedge-cutting monsters that would shatter the German defensive line that had contained the Allied invasion for 49 blood-soaked days. Before Cullin's innovation, American forces were losing an average of 17 tanks per field crossed. After its implementation, the entire German 7th Army would collapse in what historians would call the greatest American military triumph since Gettysburg. The hedgerows of Normandy were not mere field boundaries. They were earthen walls 6 to 12 feet high, their bases often 20 feet thick, constructed over 2,000 years by Norman farmers piling stones and earth in linear mounds. Centuries of root systems from trees and bushes had transformed these barriers into obstacles stronger than concrete. Each field, rarely larger than a football field, was enclosed by these ancient fortifications. The bocage country contained thousands of such fields, between the American beaches and the interior of France. General Omar Bradley would later write in his memoirs, "I had been prepared for the destruction of war, but I had not been prepared for the maze. We were fighting in terrain that negated every advantage of our mobility and firepower. Each field was a fortress, each hedgerow a castle wall." The German Wehrmacht had recognized the defensive potential of this landscape immediately after occupying France in 1940. For 4 years they had studied every hedge, mapped every field, and calculated fields of fire from thousands of positions. They had turned nature's accident into Hitler's Atlantic Wall's most formidable inland component. German defensive doctrine, refined since 1943, designated the bocage country as ideal for their resource-conserving strategy. One German 88mm gun crew with supporting infantry could hold up an entire American battalion for hours, sometimes days. The crisis had begun on D-Day +1, June 7, 1944, when the American 4th Infantry Division first encountered the hedgerows beyond Utah Beach. Lieutenant Colonel Charles Taylor of the 1st Battalion, 22nd Infantry Regiment, reported to divisional headquarters that his men had advanced only 300 yards in 6 hours, suffering 43 casualties. "We cannot see the enemy. We cannot maneuver. We can only die in place," he transmitted. The standard American tactical doctrine, developed in the wide-open training grounds of Louisiana and Texas, called for tanks to lead infantry advances across open ground. In Normandy, this doctrine collapsed within hours. When tanks attempted to go through gaps in the hedgerows, they were channeled into killing zones where German anti-tank guns waited. When they attempted to climb over the hedgerows, they exposed their thin bottom armor to enemy fire. The 13 millimeters of steel protecting a Sherman's belly was insufficient to stop even a German Panzerfaust, the handheld anti-tank weapon distributed to every German squad. Captain Charles Cawthon of the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Infantry Division, described the first attempts to breach the hedgerows. The tank would charge the hedge, its 30 tons of steel grinding forward. As it climbed, the driver would lose sight of everything but sky. The tank commander, if he was brave enough to keep his hatch open, would try to guide the driver. Then would come the sound we all learned to dread, the crack of an 88. The tank would shudder, smoke would pour from the hatches, and 5 more American boys would be dead. By June 15th, American forces had suffered 12,000 casualties while advancing an average of only 5 miles inland. At this rate, calculated First Army intelligence officers, the American army would cease to exist as an effective fighting force before reaching the Seine River. The German defenders, meanwhile, were suffering casualties at a rate of only 1 to 4 compared to the Americans. Major General Joseph Lawton Collins, commander of 7 Corps, convened an emergency meeting on June 18th at his headquarters in a Norman farmhouse. Present were representatives from the Ordnance Department, the Tank Destroyer Command, and the 1st Army Engineering Staff. Collins, known as Lightning Joe for his aggressive tactics in the Pacific, slammed his fist on the oak table. "Gentlemen, we are being defeated by agricultural archaeology. Find me a solution, or we will be here until Christmas if we last that long." The assembled officers proposed various solutions. Engineers suggested explosive charges to blow gaps in the hedgerows, but tests demonstrated it would require 1.2 million pounds of explosives for all the hedgerows that needed breaching. Bulldozers were tried but proved too vulnerable to enemy fire and too slow. White phosphorus shells were tested but proved ineffective against the earthen embankments. Meanwhile, the German defenders were perfecting their hedgerow tactics. Oberst Friedrich von der Heydte, commanding the 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment, issued tactical instructions that were captured and translated on June 23rd. Each hedgerow is to be defended as follows. Machine guns at the corners provide interlocking fields of fire. Anti-tank guns or Panzerfaust teams positioned to engage the exposed bellies of climbing tanks. Snipers to eliminate tank commanders who expose themselves. Mortars registered on the fields to catch accompanying infantry. When American pressure becomes overwhelming, withdraw to the next hedgerow and repeat. The German system was devastatingly effective. On June 24th, the American 2nd Battalion, 115th Infantry Regiment, supported by a company of Sherman tanks from the 2nd Armoured Division, attempted to advance through a single field near the village of Villiers-Fossard. The attack began at 0600 hours. By noon, 7 of 14 tanks were destroyed, 123 infantrymen were casualties, and the battalion had not gained a single yard. The German defenders, elements of the 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division, reported losses of 13 men. Sergeant Culin had been watching these failures with the eye of a man who had grown up on a farm in Cranford, New Jersey. Before the war, he had worked summers as a welder in his uncle's steel fabrication shop. He understood metal, stress points, and practical engineering in ways that West Point graduates often did not. On the evening of July 2nd, he attended a briefing where Lieutenant Colonel John W. Tuttle, commander of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, expressed his frustration. "We need to get through these hedges, not over them," Tuttle said. That night, Culin could not sleep. He walked among the destroyed tanks littering the Norman Odio Pau fields, examining their failures. He noticed that when tanks attempted to climb hedgerows, their tracks often lost traction as the center of gravity shifted backward. The tank would slide back down, sometimes throwing a track, leaving it immobilized and vulnerable. He thought about the fundamental problem differently than the engineers and ordnance officers. They were trying to overcome the hedgerows. What if, instead, the tanks could cut through them like a plow through soil? At a discussion among tankers, a soldier from Tennessee, known only as Roberts, made a comment that others laughed at. "Why don't we get some saw teeth and put them on the front of the tank and cut through these hedges?" While others dismissed the idea, Culin recognized its potential. He began developing the concept with practical engineering skills gained from his civilian experience. Working with Private John Cocker, a fellow soldier who had been a machinist before the war, Culin examined the German beach, obstacles still littering the sand from D-Day. Among these obstacles were hundreds of Czech hedgehogs, heavy steel anti-tank barriers made from crossed steel beams. The Germans had placed thousands of these along the Normandy beaches to impale landing craft. Culin pointed at the steel beams. "What if we cut these up and weld them to the front of a tank, like Tusks? The tank keeps its nose down, drives straight through the hedgerow." Cocker examined the German steel. It was high-quality carbon steel, designed to withstand the impact of landing craft. Each beam was approximately 3 meters long and 20 centimeters thick. "It might work," Cocker said, "but we'd need to calculate the angle exactly right. Too high and it won't cut. Too low and the tank will plow into the ground." They spent several days working in secret, not wanting to appear foolish if their idea failed. Using a damaged Sherman tank as their test vehicle, they welded 4 prongs made from the German beech obstacles to the front of the hull. The prongs extended approximately 2 feet beyond the tank's front and were angled at 30 degrees. The design was crude but practical. Each prong weighed approximately 200 pounds, adding 800 pounds to the tank's front end, which actually improved traction. On July 14, 1944, they conducted their demonstration for General Bradley. Captain James Depew, the 102nd Cavalry's operations officer, had arranged for senior officers to witness the test. The tank approached a hedgerow at 5 miles per hour. The steel prongs bit into the earthen wall. The tank's engine roared as its tracks churned. For a moment it seemed the tank would stall. Then, with a grinding tear, the hedgerow split apart. The tank burst through into the next field, its nose level, its belly armor protected. The entire breakthrough had taken less than 30 seconds. Bradley watched in awe as the hedgerow exploded to make way for the Sherman bursting through. The general, normally reserved, immediately grasped the significance. "Sergeant, how quickly can we modify 500 tanks?" First Army's ordnance companies calculated they could modify 50 tanks per day using the German beech obstacles. There were enough obstacles on Omaha and Utah beaches to modify over 600 tanks. Welding teams were immediately organized. Lieutenant Colonel John Medaris of the United States Army Ordnance Department was dispatched to the United Kingdom to have tanks modified before being shipped to France, and additional arc welding equipment and crews were transported to France by air. The modifications were given highest priority. Within days, ordnance units throughout the American sector were working around the clock. The 111th Ordnance Company and other units fashioned and welded cutters onto Sherman tanks under camouflage netting to prevent German observation. By July 22nd, over 300 tanks had been modified with what were officially called Culin hedge cutters, though tank crews had adopted their own terminology. They called them Rhinos, and tanks so equipped were known as Rhino tanks. The first combat test came during the preparatory attacks before Operation Cobra. The American 90th Infantry Division, which had suffered 2,000 casualties in 2 weeks while advancing only 3 miles, attacked with 15 Rhino-equipped tanks. In 4 hours they advanced 2 miles, destroying 17 German positions and suffering only 43 casualties. The division commander, Brigadier General J. McKelvey, reported, "The hedgerow cutter has restored mobility to American arms." The German reaction was documented in a captured letter from Hauptmann Wilhelm Detmer of the 2nd SS Panzer Division, written on July 20th. "The Americans have developed a new tank that tears through hedgerows like paper. Our entire defensive system, perfected over 4 years, has been neutralized by what appears to be scrap metal welded to their tanks. The psychological effect on our troops is devastating. They no longer feel safe behind any hedgerow." Operation Cobra, the American breakout offensive, began on July 25, 1944. The plan specifically exploited the mobility restored by the Culin hedge cutter. Following the largest tactical use of heavy bombers in support of ground forces yet seen in the war, 300 Rhino tanks attacked along the Saint-Lô-Perriers road. The German defenders, stunned by the bombing and unprepared for tanks that could penetrate hedgerows at will, collapsed within hours. By nightfall of July 25th, American forces had advanced 3 miles, farther than they had moved in the previous 3 weeks. The breakthrough accelerated on July 26th. The American 1st Infantry Division, spearheaded by 40 Rhino tanks, advanced 6 miles. The 3rd Armored Division, with 60 Rhino tanks, advanced 8 miles. German units, trained to conduct fighting withdrawals from hedgerow to hedgerow, found their tactics useless. Rhino tanks would burst through hedgerows unexpectedly, causing panic and disrupting organized retreats. Private Hans Müller of the 2nd SS Panzer Division Das Reich was captured on July 27th. His interrogation report provides insight into German morale. "We called them Devil's Horns, the steel tusks on American tanks. You would be manning your position, watching the gap in the hedgerow, when suddenly the earth would explode beside you and a tank would burst through. We had no answer for it. The Panzerfaust was useless against a tank that appeared suddenly at close range. Many men simply ran." Oberstleutnant Friedrich Wilhelm von der Lancken, commanding a battle group of the Panzer Lehr Division, described the breakthrough in his post-war memoir. "The Rhino tanks came through the hedgerows like a tide. We had positioned our anti-tank guns to cover the gaps and the tops of the hedgerows. Suddenly, tanks were bursting through the walls themselves, appearing in our flanks and rear. Our entire defensive scheme, rehearsed and perfected since 1940, dissolved in minutes." By July 28th, the German 7th Army was in full retreat. The careful defensive positions prepared over 4 years were abandoned in 3 days. American armored spearheads, led by Rhino tanks, were advancing 20 miles per day. The German command structure, dependent on holding successive defensive lines, collapsed entirely. In the 7 days from July 25th to August 1st, American forces advanced 60 miles, destroyed or captured 300 German tanks, took 20,000 prisoners, and inflicted an estimated 40,000 casualties on German forces. American casualties, while significant at 6,000, were a fraction of what pre-Cobra estimates had predicted for such an advance. The German disaster was complete. On August 1st, Hitler finally authorized a withdrawal, but it was too late. American armored columns, led by Rhino tanks, had already cut off major withdrawal routes. The attempted German counterattack at Mortain on August 7th, designed to cut off the American breakthrough, failed catastrophically. Rhino tanks, able to maneuver freely through the hedgerow country, surrounded and destroyed the attacking German divisions. Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, commanding German forces in Normandy, sent an urgent message to Hitler's headquarters on July 17th. "The enemy has overcome the hedgerow barrier with a simple device that we failed to anticipate. Our entire defensive strategy in Normandy is now untenable." Lieutenant General Walter Warlimont, Deputy Chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, testified after the war, "The American hedge cutter invalidated 4 years of German defensive planning in France. We had based our entire strategy on the defensive value of the Norman hedgerows. When this was neutralized by a simple welding modification, we had no alternative plan. The pursuit across France that followed was enabled by the momentum gained during the Cobra breakout. The same tanks that broke through the hedgerows raced across France, liberating Paris on August 25th and reaching the German border by September 11th. The Western Front, stalemated for 7 weeks in the hedgerows, had moved 400 miles in 6 weeks after the breakthrough. Sergeant Cullin's innovation drew recognition from the highest levels. On August 12th, he was awarded the Legion of Merit by General Eisenhower personally. The citation read, "Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III, through his ingenuity and technical skill, developed a device which restored mobility to American armored forces and directly contributed to the liberation of France. The technical details of the Culin hedge cutter were immediately classified and remained so, until 1946. The Army was concerned that the Germans might develop countermeasures if the exact specifications were known. Post-war analysis revealed that over 500 tanks were eventually equipped with hedge cutters, using approximately 2,000 tons of German beach obstacles, turning Hitler's own defensive preparations against him. Tank Commander Staff Sergeant William Dentz of the 2nd Armoured Division wrote to his wife on July 16th, "For 5 weeks we've been stuck in these fields, losing friends daily. Now we have the Rhino, and we're finally moving. You can see it in everyone's eyes. We're going to win this thing." The modifications were not without problems. The added weight on the front of the tanks increased stress on the transmission. Tank drivers had to be retrained to approach hedgerows at the correct angle and speed. Too fast, and the impact could damage the prongs or throw a track. Too slow, and the tank would stall. The optimal speed was determined to be between 4 and 6 miles per hour, with the driver maintaining steady throttle through the entire penetration. Technical Sergeant Robert Carft, a maintenance specialist with the 3rd Armoured Division, documented the mechanical challenges in his official report dated July 10th. The hedge cutters are causing premature wear on front bogie wheels and return rollers. We're seeing transmission failures at 3 times the normal rate. However, these mechanical losses are acceptable compared to the catastrophic combat losses we were suffering before. The psychological impact on American forces was as significant as the tactical advantage. Private First Class Robert Caper, the famous war photographer, was present during one of the early attacks using Culin's device. His photographs, published in Life magazine, showed Sherman tanks with their improvised Tusks tearing through hedgerows while German defenders fled in apparent panic. One image, which became iconic, showed a proned tank bursting through a hedgerow in an explosion of earth and vegetation, its steel prongs gleaming in the Norman sunlight. The Rhino tanks could create new routes of advance, making German mining of existing gaps irrelevant. They could approach German positions from unexpected directions. They could pursue retreating German forces through terrain previously considered impassable for armor. Each of these capabilities multiplied the effectiveness of American armored forces. Technical analysis conducted by the Ordnance Department after the war revealed the engineering elegance of Culin's solution. The steel prongs, positioned at the optimal 30-degree angle, acted as both cutting edges and leverage points. As the tank drove forward, the prongs would slice through roots and compress earth, creating fracture points in the hedgerow. The tank's weight provided the force necessary to exploit these fractures. The entire process utilized the tank's existing capabilities without requiring any modification to the engine, transmission, or tracks. The cost-effectiveness of the modification was remarkable. Each Culin hedge cutter cost approximately $50 in materials and 4 hours of labor to install. The German beach obstacles were free, having been abandoned by the retreating Germans. In contrast, specialized British vehicles designed for obstacle breaching cost over £40,000 each and required months of specialized training for their crews. Major Geoffrey Pryor of the British 79th Armoured Division, which specialized in specialized armor, observed American Rhino tanks in operation on August 2nd. His report to British headquarters stated, "The American hedge cutter is brilliantly simple. We spent 2 years developing specialized vehicles for every conceivable obstacle. The Americans solved their most critical tactical problem with scrap metal and welding torches. The infantry tactics evolved rapidly to exploit the Rhino tanks' capabilities. Instead of following tanks through gaps in hedgerows where German artillery was registered, infantry would wait until Rhino tanks had penetrated at multiple points, then flood through the new openings. This dispersed the infantry, making them less vulnerable to artillery and machine gun fire. Captain William Davidson of the 29th Infantry Division described the new tactics in his after-action report. The Rhino changed everything. Instead of assaulting fortified gaps, we would send 3 or 4 Rhinos through a hedgerow at different points simultaneously. The Germans couldn't cover all the breakthrough points. We would exploit the confusion, rolling up their positions from the flanks. German attempts to counter the Rhino tanks proved ineffective. Initially, they tried placing larger mines in hedgerows, but the tanks' momentum carried them through before the mines could cause critical damage. They attempted to reinforce hedgerows with steel beams, but this was impractical given the thousands of hedgerows in Normandy. They tried concentrating anti-tank guns to cover likely penetration points, but Rhino tanks could create new penetration points at will. Oberst Hermann Balck, commanding the remnants of the Panzer Lehr Division, wrote in his war diary on August 6th, "We have no tactical answer to the hedge cutters. Each American tank is now capable of creating its own avenue of advance. Our defensive doctrine, based on channeling enemy armor into kill zones, is obsolete." The strategic implications of the Rhino tank extended beyond Normandy. The rapid breakthrough prevented German forces from establishing a defensive line along the Seine River. It disrupted German plans to withdraw heavy equipment from France. It prevented the systematic destruction of French infrastructure that Hitler had ordered. The speed of the American advance, initiated by the Rhino-enabled breakthrough, saved countless French civilian lives and preserved much of France's industrial capacity. General Eisenhower, in a letter to Army Chief of Staff General George Marshall dated August 20th, wrote, "The hedge cutter has operational and strategic implications beyond its tactical utility. By restoring mobility to our armoured forces, it has prevented the campaign from becoming a replay of World War I's trench warfare. We are now conducting mobile operations across France at a pace that exceeds our most optimistic pre-invasion planning." In a television interview with CBS correspondent Walter Cronkite on the 20th anniversary of D-Day in 1964, Eisenhower recalled, "There was a little sergeant, his name was Culin, and he had an idea, and his idea was that we could fasten knives, great big steel knives, in front of these tanks, and as they came along they would cut off these banks right at ground level. They would go through on the level. Kiel would carry with themselves a little bit of camouflage for a while. And this idea was brought to the captain, to the major, to the colonel, and it got high enough that somebody did something about it, and that was General Bradley, and he did it very quickly." The story of Sergeant Culin and his hedge cutter spread throughout the American military, inspiring other innovations. In Italy, soldiers developed improvised mountings for captured German weapons. In the Pacific, Marines created waterproofing modifications for tanks operating in jungle conditions. The principle that field innovation could solve seemingly intractable problems became embedded in American military culture. The Army's official history, published in 1947, devoted an entire chapter to the Culin hedge cutter. The authors wrote, "No single tactical innovation had greater impact on the campaign in Northwest Europe than Sergeant Cullin's hedge cutter. It transformed the battlefield, restored American mobility, and directly contributed to the collapse of German defences in France." Post-war analysis by the Operations Research Office of Johns Hopkins University quantified the impact of the hedge cutter. They calculated that without it, the advance through Normandy would have required an additional 6 to 8 weeks, and resulted in approximately 40,000 additional American casualties. The German 7th Army would have had time to conduct an organized withdrawal, preserving much of its combat power for defense of the German border. After the war, Curtis G. Culin married Bernice Enright in 1945. They lived in New York City, where he worked for Schenley Industries. The personal impact on Sergeant Culin was significant but complicated. He had been promoted and transferred to other duties after his innovation. He was uncomfortable with his celebrity, preferring to credit the soldiers who had helped him develop and test the device. In interviews, he maintained, "I just saw a problem and figured out how to fix it with what we had available." Culin died on November 20th, 1963, in Greenwich Village, Manhattan, New York. He was only 48 years old. He had kept a piece of a hedge cutter prong as a memento of his wartime service, but rarely spoke about his innovation that had changed the course of the war. The French government, however, considered his contribution invaluable. In 1948, Culin was awarded the Croix de Guerre with Palm by the French Republic. The citation read, "For an innovation that liberated French soil from Nazi occupation and saved countless French lives." The ceremony was held in the town of Saint-Lô, which had been 95% destroyed in the fighting before the breakout. Veterans of the Normandy campaign never forgot the importance of the hedge cutter. At unit reunions, tank crews would toast Culin's Tusks and share stories of bursting through hedgerows. Infantry veterans would speak of the relief they felt when they first saw a Rhino tank tear through a hedgerow, knowing they would not have to assault another fortified gap. The hedge cutter influenced post-war military design. The principle of field expedient modification was incorporated into American vehicle design. Mounting points for additional equipment became standard. The idea that combat vehicles should be adaptable to unexpected challenges became a cornerstone of American military vehicle design philosophy. The Soviet military, which studied the Normandy campaign intensively, incorporated lessons from the hedge cutter into their own doctrine. The concept of soldier-driven innovation was partially adopted, though within the constraints of Soviet military culture. Soviet armored vehicles of the Cold War era often featured mounting points for field-expedient modifications. The British military also learned from the American experience. The Royal Armoured Corps revised its doctrine to emphasize field adaptation and soldier innovation. The influence of Culin III. The example could be seen in British operations from Malaya to the Falklands. In military education, the Culin hedge cutter became a standard case study in innovation and adaptation. Staff colleges around the world taught the principle that tactical innovation could come from any level of command. The story challenged the traditional top-down approach to military problem-solving and encouraged officers to listen to their enlisted personnel's ideas. The German military, rebuilt in the 1950s as part of NATO, studied the hedge cutter as an example of American military culture's strengths. Bundeswehr doctrine emphasized the importance of initiative at all levels and the danger of rigid defensive thinking. German officers were taught that technological superiority meant nothing if the enemy could innovate faster than you could adapt. Military historians have debated whether the hedge cutter was truly decisive or simply one factor among many in the Allied victory. What is undeniable is that it solved a critical tactical problem at exactly the moment when solution was desperately needed. It restored American mobility, shattered German defensive plans, and accelerated the liberation of France by weeks or possibly months. Dr. Stephen Ambrose, the prominent World War II historian, wrote in his 1994 book D-Day, "The Culin hedge cutter represents the best of American military tradition, practical innovation by citizen, soldiers. It was not developed in a laboratory or staff college, but in a Norman field by a sergeant who understood both the problem and the materials available to solve it." The technological simplicity of the hedge cutter has often been contrasted with the complexity of German wonder weapons. While Germany developed jet aircraft, ballistic missiles, and super-heavy tanks, none of these had the battlefield impact of 4 pieces of welded steel. The hedge cutter demonstrated that in warfare, the simple solution that works is superior to the complex solution that might work. Colonel Hans von Luck, who commanded the 21st Panzer Division's Reconnaissance Battalion, wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans defeated us not with superior weapons, but with superior problem-solving. While we waited for orders and followed doctrine, they invented solutions in the field. The hedge cutter was the perfect example of this advantage." The preservation of hedge cutters became a priority for military museums after the war. However, most Rhino tanks had their prongs removed after the hedgerow country was cleared, as the added weight reduced fuel efficiency and caused mechanical strain during road marches. Only a handful of original hedge cutters survived. One is displayed at the National Museum of the United States Army, another is at the Musée Mémorial de la Bataille de Normandy in Bayeux, France. In 2004, on the 60th anniversary of D-Day, a memorial was dedicated to Sergeant Culin in Saint-Lô. The memorial features a replica hedge cutter mounted on a preserved Sherman tank. The inscription reads, "To Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III, whose innovation broke the stalemate and opened the door to liberation." Veterans of the Normandy campaign, many in their 80s, attended the ceremony. A plaque dedicated to Curtis Culin can also be found affixed to a boulder on the North Union Avenue side of the Cranford Municipal Building in his hometown of Cranford, New Jersey. The plaque quotes Eisenhower. Sergeant Cullin's contributions to success in the Normandy breakout reflected Yankee ingenuity at its best. Modern military forces continue to study the Culin hedge cutter as an example of successful innovation. In Iraq and Afghanistan, American forces encouraged similar field modifications to deal with improvised explosive devices and urban combat challenges. The principle that solutions can come from any rank remains embedded in American military culture. The hedge cutter's influence extends beyond military applications. In business schools, it is taught as an example of disruptive innovation and practical problem-solving. In engineering courses, it demonstrates the value of simple solutions to complex problems. In leadership training, it exemplifies the importance of listening to ideas from all organizational levels. Military theorist Martin van Creveld wrote in his analysis of the Normandy campaign, "The Culin hedge cutter demonstrates that in war, the ability to adapt is more important than initial preparation. The Germans had 4 years to prepare their defences. The Americans needed only days to render them obsolete." The environmental impact of the hedge cutter has also been studied. The device allowed American forces to advance without destroying the ancient hedgerows with explosives or bulldozers. Most of the Norman bocage survived the war intact, preserving a landscape that had existed since medieval times. French environmental historians credit the hedge cutter with saving one of France's unique agricultural landscapes. The economic impact was equally significant. The rapid American advance prevented the systematic German destruction of French infrastructure. Bridges, railways, and factories that would have been demolished in a slower retreat were captured intact. The French economy recovered faster than anticipated, partly because the speed of liberation prevented scorched earth tactics. In military procurement, the hedge cutter became a cautionary tale about over-specification and over-engineering. The British had spent 2 years developing specialised vehicles like the Churchill Ava for obstacle breaching. The Americans solved their most critical obstacle problem with field-expedient welding. This lesson influenced American procurement philosophy toward providing adaptable platforms rather than specialised vehicles. The human dimension of the hedge cutter story resonates beyond its military significance. Sergeant Culin was 29 years old when he developed his innovation. His story demonstrated that in the American military, good ideas could come from anyone, regardless of rank or background. This egalitarian aspect of the story made it particularly powerful in American military culture. General der Infanterie Günther Blumentritt, Chief of Staff to Field Marshal von Rundstedt, testified after the war, "The appearance of tanks that could drive through hedgerows was more demoralizing than the Allied bombing. Bombs we understood and could endure. But when our strongest defensive position could be penetrated at will, the soldiers lost faith in our ability to stop the Americans." The training implications of the hedge cutter extended throughout the war. Tank crews arriving in Europe after August 1944 were trained in hedgerow penetration techniques, even though they would never encounter hedgerows. The principle of aggressive obstacle breaching became standard doctrine. The confidence that there's always a way through became embedded in American armored forces culture. Veterans organizations have ensured that the story of Sergeant Culin and his hedge cutter is not forgotten. The 2nd Armored Division Association maintains a scholarship in Culin's name for engineering students. The 3rd Armored Division Veterans Association created a Culin Award for innovative problem solving. These organizations recognize that while generals may win campaigns, it is often sergeants who win battles. The international recognition of Culin's achievement continued long after the war. The British, Belgian, and Dutch governments recognized his contribution to their liberation. The hedge cutter's place in the pantheon of military innovations is secure. Alongside radar, code breaking, and the atomic bomb, it represents the technologies that won World War II. But unlike those complex and expensive innovations, the hedge cutter was simple, cheap, and developed by an enlisted man in the field. The hedgerows of Normandy still stand today, many bearing scars from 1944. Tourists can see the marks where Rhino tanks burst through, the steel prongs leaving distinctive gouges that have not healed after 80 years. These scars are monuments to American innovation and determination, permanent reminders of the day a sergeant's simple idea changed the course of history. French farmers, whose ancestors built the hedgerows over centuries, now conduct tours for visitors. They point to the breakthrough points and tell the story of les cornes du diable, the devil's horns, that liberated their land. Many keep pieces of hedge cutter prongs found in their fields, treating them as precious relics of liberation. In the final analysis, the Culin hedge cutter represents more than a tactical innovation. It embodies the American approach to warfare, emphasizing practical problem-solving over doctrine, innovation over tradition, and results over process. It demonstrated that the American citizen soldier, given the freedom to innovate, could overcome any obstacle. The story of Sergeant Curtis Culin III and his hedge cutter ultimately transcends military history. It is a story about human ingenuity, about the power of practical thinking, about the importance of listening to ideas from unexpected sources. It reminds us that the solution to seemingly impossible problems might be simpler than we imagine, requiring only the courage to think differently and the freedom to try. In June 1944, the Allied invasion of Europe was stalled by ancient farm boundaries that had become perfect defensive fortifications. By August, those same forces were racing across France toward Germany. The difference was 4 pieces of steel welded to the front of a tank by a sergeant who understood that sometimes the best way over an obstacle is straight through it. What had begun as a desperate search for a solution to an unexpected, tactical problem had become one of the decisive innovations of the Second World War. The German 7th Army, which had confidently expected to contain the Allies in Normandy until winter, was destroyed as an effective fighting force in a matter of weeks. France, which German planning had expected to defend for months, was liberated in weeks. 500 tanks modified, thousands of hedgerows breached, 60 miles advanced in 7 days, 20,000 German prisoners. But behind these numbers lies a more profound truth. A single innovation by a single soldier had changed the course of the war. The hedgerows that had promised to be Normandy's defensive masterpiece became highways for American armor. The Culin hedge cutter remains one of the most perfect examples of military innovation in history. Born of necessity, developed with available materials, implemented with extraordinary speed, and decisive in its impact. It required no new technology, no massive investment, no years of development. It required only the insight to see the problem differently and the freedom to implement a solution. Today, military forces around the world study the hedge cutter as a model of successful innovation, but its lessons extend far beyond military applications. It teaches that solutions often come from unexpected sources, that simple answers can solve complex problems, that the freedom to innovate is itself a strategic advantage. The German Wehrmacht, which had built its entire defensive strategy on the impenetrability of the Norman hedgerows, learned too late that no obstacle is impenetrable to those with the freedom and ingenuity to innovate. The Atlantic Wall, Hitler's fortress Europe, was breached not by overwhelming force but by practical engineering and American common sense. Sergeant Curtis G. Culin III passed away in 1963, having lived to see his innovations studied in military academies around the world. He remained modest about his achievement to the end, insisting he had simply done what needed to be done with what was available. But history records a different verdict. His hedge cutter was the key that unlocked the door to France, the innovation that restored mobility to Allied forces, the simple solution that solved an impossible problem. The liberation of France, the collapse of Nazi Germany, the end of World War II in Europe, all were accelerated by 4 pieces of German steel welded to American tanks by an American sergeant who understood that the best way to deal with an obstacle is not always to go over or around it. Sometimes the best way is straight through, with determination, ingenuity and steel tusks that could tear through anything the enemy put in the way. The hedge cutter changed everything. It transformed immobile tanks into breakthrough weapons. It converted defensive terrain into avenues of advance. It turned American frustration into German panic. Most importantly, it demonstrated that the American soldier, given the freedom to innovate, could overcome any obstacle, solve any problem, and ultimately win any war. The hedgerows of Normandy, which had promised to be the grave of American armor, became instead the proving ground for American ingenuity, and the steel tusks that broke through them became the symbols of a victory that changed the world.